Hello everyone, today is day 39 of solving a LeetCode problem every day, and today I'm going to be solving another JavaScript question, which is Memoize. So given a function fn, return a Memoize version of that function. A Memoize function is a function that will never be called twice with the same inputs. Instead, it will return a cached value. So first of all, we're going to have to memoize three possible functions, either a sum function, which takes in a and b as parameters and returns a and b, or a plus b. And all this part is saying right here is if we're given the arguments ba, we don't need to cache the value for this for a, b also. So let's say we're given the arguments 3, 2, and 2, 3. We still want to perform two separate calls. So even though these both produce 5, since 3 plus 2 and 2 plus 3 are both 5, we still want to make two separate function calls. So the second function is just the fib function. So we're returning fib n minus 1 plus fib n minus 2 with 1 as the base case if n is less than or equal to 1. And then factorial, which accepts a single integer n and returns 1 if n is less than or equal to 1, or factorial n minus 1 times n otherwise. So first of all, the general idea behind memoizing a function is you might have a function that performs some super expensive calculations, and if you're given the same arguments, you don't want to do that over and over again since it can be pretty inefficient. So what you can instead do is cache the value of the output of that first function call, and then if the same function is called with the same arguments, you can just pull the value out of a cache so you don't have to perform the expensive calculations again. So it pretty much just can make your applications more efficient. So what we're going to start out by doing is creating a cache, and our cache is just going to be an object. And essentially what we're going to do within this function is check if our if the value that we need is already within this cache, and if it's not, then we're just going to perform the function call. So if y'all don't remember, in JavaScript you can return functions from functions, and even though this function is going to be called from some different context, it's still going to have access to this cache variable because of closures in JavaScript. So what we can say is, well, first we actually have to stringify the arguments. So if I console.log the args, let me run this. So as we can see here, we have arrays. So if I write type of args, all right, it says objects, but we have arrays. And essentially what we want to do is find a way to store keys in this cache, but we can't store the arrays themselves. And the reason why is that we'd be storing references. So when we make the comparisons, we'd be comparing reference to reference, which isn't what we're looking for. We want to be comparing actual values. So what we can do is we can say string args is equal to json.stringify args. And now if I console.log type of string args alongside the string args itself, here we now see that these are strings. So we can actually we can compare string to string, and so this is going to make it much easier to work with. So we can now check if string args is in the cache, and if it is, we can just return the value that already exists there. Otherwise, what we want to do is call the function. So we can say let result equals function, and we want to spread the arguments again, since all these functions take values and not an array. And then we can just cache that value. So we can say cache string args is equal to result, and then we can say return result. So now if I run this and submit, that's what we're looking for. So basically, I'm just going to explain this real quick again. So we're turning our arguments into a string, since if it was the arrays that we're using as the keys itself, whatever this current args is never going to equal what's in the array since we're comparing by reference. So that's why we're stringifying it. The first thing we do is we check if the string args is already in the cache, and if it is, we return whatever the stored value in the cache is. Otherwise, we perform the function call on whatever the arguments are, we store it into our cache, and then we return our result. So I'm not going to worry as much about time complexity here, but some things you might want to keep in mind is there's a little extra overhead when you have to memorize your functions. So for one, performing the rest operator and the spread operator here takes O of n time. But I mean, most of the time that's going to be fine, since for example with the sum function you're always going to be taking a and b as parameters. So you're always just going to be spreading or resting over two parameters, which is fine. But if you have a function that might take up like over 100 parameters or something, or it just basically has like a variable amount of parameters that it can take, it could be inefficient to do something like this in that case. The second thing that you might want to keep in mind is that it also takes a little extra time to stringify your arguments, but I mean that should be fine too. And the last thing is that for this specific problem, this would be like a complete implementation, since these are the only three functions that you might have to memorize. But if you were to memorize or create a function that memoizes any function, what you might also want to do here is passing an optional context. And the reason why is if you have a function that performs some type of calculations using the this keyword, the way this function is essentially being called, or like the way we're essentially doing this, it's not going to work because we'd have to bind the this keyword to like a specific context. But I'm not going to get into too much detail about that. I mean, if you're interested about that, just search up how the this keyword works in JavaScript, and that can help you understand a little more about that. But yeah, that's my solution for the day.